Exposure and how to expose photos properly is a topic that I get asked about quite a lot, and rightfully so. I know a lot of people struggle with it. When I first started out in photography, I definitely struggled with exposure and made lots of mistakes. So I want to go over 5 really common mistakes that photographers make when it comes to exposing their images. Okay, so the first mistake is not using the correct metering mode for your camera. And this applies more so to people who are shooting in any mode where the camera is making decisions for you. I'm talking about aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, or auto ISO. Or if you're shooting on a DSLR camera like this 5D Mark III, unlike a mirrorless camera, when you look down the viewfinder, you're seeing through the lens and you're not seeing what the resulting exposure is going to look like. This has happened to me way too many times, but you could easily look through the viewfinder, take a photo, and it's either way too bright or way too dark because you weren't paying attention to the meter. So most cameras have 3 main metering modes. There are more depending on the camera that you have, but the 3 main ones are a spot meter, which reads the light from a predetermined point in the frame. Then you have center weighted average, so it's going to take an average of the light across the frame but give weight to the center portion of the image. And then you have evaluative metering, which is just an average of the frame overall. And you can see how these different modes would be advantageous for different situations. For example, if you're shooting the moon on a dark night sky, you probably wouldn't want to use evaluative metering because you just want that one point in the sky, the moon, to be well exposed. And so it's probably a better idea to use spot metering. If you're photographing a portrait where your subject's in the center of the frame, center weighted average is probably going to be your best bet because you definitely want to expose for the skin tones, and especially if your background is really bright, you don't want an underexposed image of your subject. If you are using aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, anything like that, you can always use your exposure compensation dial to adjust your exposure and get it looking correct. But in my opinion, it's best to use the correct metering mode for the correct situation and to help you save some time and potentially a mistake with your exposure while you're shooting. Now, personally, for myself, I'm using a mirrorless camera, so I can see the exposure in real time, and I also shoot on full manual mode, so I really don't pay any attention whatsoever to the metering modes in my camera. The second mistake is not using the exposure tools that are built into your camera. Most cameras, especially ones that came out in the last 4 or 5 years, have a feature called zebras. Zebras. I never know which one to say. People were going to correct me either way. But then also, even if you don't have a modern camera, cameras like this have a feature called highlight warning. So essentially what these allow you to do is to see the upper limit of your exposure, how far you can go until you start clipping your highlights. And clipping just means losing information. Now, in most circumstances, you want to preserve as much highlight detail as possible, but you also want to expose to the right, or ETTR. And simply what that means is pushing as much of the data within the histogram over to the right hand side, the highlight side of the histogram. Doing this is going to give you a much cleaner result in the shadowy parts of your image. So I actually set my Sony camera's zebras to 109 plus lower limit, and that means there's going to be this stripy pattern on any part of the image that is overexposed. So most of the time I just want to avoid having those stripy lines in my images. I'll adjust my shutter speed, ISO, or aperture until they go away. The same thing goes for the highlight warning tool. Unfortunately, you can't see it in real time on a DSLR, but when you review the photo after taking it, it'll show you exactly what is going to be overexposed. In my opinion, it is a lot easier to recover shadow detail when you're shooting raw in post-production, and also it just looks a little bit better to lose a little bit of shadow detail versus losing highlight detail. Losing that highlight detail, especially when it's in a part of the image that is important to the story, can really look super amateur, so you definitely want to avoid that. So the third mistake that a lot of people make is treating every single camera exactly the same when it comes to exposing your images. And in reality, every camera is different and they have different tolerances. For example, my trusty 5D Mark III over here, which back in the day was actually really popular with wedding and portrait photographers because of its beautiful color and skin tones, it is notoriously bad for not being able to recover shadow information very well. And so with this camera, I would expose completely different than how I would with any of my other cameras, whether it's Sony, Fuji, or Canon. On this camera, I would slightly overexpose my images because having to bring back any of that shadow detail in post will result in all sorts of graininess and color noise. Some cameras are better at recovering highlight detail, some better at recovering shadow detail, and it's up to you to do a little bit of research into your camera to find out what the strengths and weaknesses are, and also just use the camera over a couple of weeks. Just shoot every day and try to figure out what is the camera capable of when you bring it into Lightroom and try to recover shadows and highlights. And that's often why I will never take a brand new camera out with me on a professional job. I really want to get to know the camera first before I put it into a situation where I'm going to rely on it to get professional photos. Okay, so the next one is when photographers expect way too much out of their equipment. It's important to remember the higher the dynamic range of your scene, the more difficult it's going to be for your camera to capture all the details. So what I mean by high dynamic range is that there is a lot of difference between the brightest part of the image and the darkest part of an image. Say, for example, you're shooting on a bright sunny day, you've got the bright sky in one part of the frame and maybe the shadows of a building in another. And a lot of photographers focus on having a camera that is able to do that, rather than looking for photo opportunities that are easier for your camera to actually capture. And you can actually have some control over this as well by adding lights, using flash, bounce, all kinds of things to decrease the dynamic range of your photo. You can also shoot at a completely different time of day. Oftentimes I will shoot at blue hour because the light is really nice and soft, and even overall gives you a much better exposure. So I've definitely learned to consider the dynamic range of the photo and not expect too much out of my gear. So here's an example of a really high dynamic range photo on the right and a low dynamic range photo on the left. And in my opinion, I think one looks much better than the other. Okay, so the final mistake, and perhaps the most important one in this whole video, is trying to expose for perfection and not exposing for the photo. When I first started photography, I heard someone give the advice that you need to preserve all the detail in your photo, from highlights to shadows. And I mistakenly thought that that meant that you needed to show all of that detail in the resulting photo. And I would spend hours massaging the photo with the tone curve and the highlight and shadow sliders so that I could show all of the detail. And what I realized over time is that in photography, you really have to avoid giving your viewer too much to look at. If you've got a portrait of the person and the goal is to show off their expression and their face, it shouldn't matter whether the background is completely blown out. That's not the focus of the image. Imagine if you were trying to preserve all that detail behind them, you'd end up with a dark and kind of grainy face area when you go and process the photo. Sometimes it's okay to overexpose the sky or lose a little bit of shadow detail. It makes the photo look more real and more authentic. And some photographers make these decisions while they're shooting. They don't mind blowing out those highlights. And other photographers try to conserve all the detail in their photo while they're shooting so that then they can make a decision in post of what details to show, keeping in mind that they don't want to overwhelm the viewer. So that's one of the biggest things that I've learned: expose for the photo, not for perfection. Here's an example of a photo that I took recently that I processed kind of to reflect how I used to think about processing photos versus a photo that I processed to look more natural. You guys let me know which one you prefer. There is a lot to exposure and a lot that I didn't touch on in this video, so if you have any questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below. I try to help out as many people as I can. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.